A room in England, somewhere between Dover and Barrow-in-Furness, in any of the 10,000 houses where a wireless set is warming up in the dark. The blackout curtains are drawn. It is the evening of June 4th, 1940. A voice comes through the speaker. Not a rough voice, a careful, BBC-trained voice, reading measured sentences. It speaks of fighting on the beaches, of fighting in the fields and in the streets, of never surrendering. Many people who lived through that summer remembered this moment for the rest of their lives. Remembered the voice, the words, the feeling that someone was finally saying what needed to be said. And when they remembered it as Winston Churchill's voice. It wasn't. Churchill delivered his speech to the House of Commons that afternoon at 20 minutes to 4. He sat down just after 4. And we then went home. He did not repeat the speech on the radio that evening. The thought apparently did not occur to him or to anyone else. What British civilians heard was a BBC announcer reading excerpts on the nightly news. The voice was steady, professional, and entirely wrong. This is the Britain that summer was made in, a nation receiving its finest hour at second hand, through a filter, in a blackout, trying to understand what was happening to it. This is the story of what they actually said. In the spring of 1940, most people in Britain believe the war will be a long one. That is not quite the same as believing it will be hard. Hard and long are different calculations. The French army, 4 million men, the largest standing force in Western Europe, holds the Maginot Line, and a fortification of tunnels and gun emplacements and reinforced concrete stretching nearly 400 miles along the Franco-German border. Britain has sent the British Expeditionary Force, over 300,000 professional soldiers, to help defend France. The Allied position, on paper, is formidable. What is less formidable is the information the British public is receiving. In April, German forces invade Norway. The campaign goes badly for Britain. It goes badly quickly. But the newspapers, shaped by official guidance from the Ministry of Information, report something closer to reassurance than truth. Mass Observation, the social survey organization founded in 1936 to create, in its own phrase, an anthropology of ourselves, records the result, a soaring distrust of British news outlets, not ignited by wildly erroneous and optimistic coverage. A crack runs through the spring of 1940. Not quite fear, not quite doubt, but a quiet suspicion that what the public is being told and what is actually happening are running on separate tracks. For 8 months since September 1939, the war has produced almost nothing visible. Charles Wheeler, who would spend decades reporting for the BBC, was 16 years old that winter. He captures the mood. People are unhappy, asking what the hell is going on. Something is wrong, but nobody will say clearly what. It is already a war people are watching through a slightly frosted window. Then, on the morning of May 10th, the frost comes off. Germany invades France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. It is also the day Winston Churchill becomes Prime Minister, though he inherits the catastrophe before the first reports are fully understood. 3 days later, May 13th, Churchill stands before the House of Commons for the first time as its leader. He has nothing to offer, he tells the House, but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. It is a speech that describes a disaster without yet knowing its full scale. The scale becomes clear almost immediately. The historian Julian Jackson later identifies May 13th as the day France was effectively lost. That same afternoon, German armored forces cross the Meuse near Sedan. The French fail to mount a counterattack while the bridgehead is still small enough to close. The window stays open for a matter of hours. It is never shut. On the morning of May 15th, Paul Reynaud, the French Prime Minister, calls Churchill. France is beaten, he says. Though Churchill does not believe him. Surely, he says, it can't have happened so soon. It has happened that soon. 3 Panzer Corps are driving northwest toward the English Channel, splitting the French and British forces, trapping the strongest French divisions and nearly all of the BEF in Belgium. In British kitchens, the wireless delivers each bulletin slightly worse than the one before. Nobody says invasion. Nobody says collapse. The language stays careful, and the meaning leaks through anyway. In the pauses, in the phrasing, in the tone of voice. People feel the ground moving before they understand what is moving it. By the last days of May, the BEF is backed against the sea. Ahead of them, the beaches of Dunkirk in northern France. Behind them, the German army. Frederick Barker of the 4th Division, Royal Engineers, and watches boats arriving, leaving, and occasionally sinking. He watches men swimming out to ships, arms working until they don't. Their bodies lie face down in the water. The shelving beach is so gradual that the water stays shallow hundreds of yards out, and a man wading toward the ships has a long way to wade before a deck is within reach. Smoke rises from burning oil tanks in columns visible for miles. Stuka dive bombers come in low and scream as they dive. The sea, for several days, is flat and bright and calm, which makes every ship on it a clear target. Then a fog rolls in for 48 hours, and the Luftwaffe is grounded. Lives are saved in their hundreds, then their thousands, then their hundreds of thousands. Between May 26th and June 4th, more than 338,000 men are lifted from Dunkirk's beaches, and the trains carrying them arrive at Dover and Ramsgate and Sheerness bearing men in salt-crusted rags, some without boots. Women stand on platforms with tea urns. What a correspondent from Time magazine records is the cumulative effect. Each successive boatload that came in safely seemed so precious and triumphant that British morale soared out of the jaws of death. The press understands what the moment requires. The little ships, the small civilian boats that joined the Navy's vessels in the evacuation, are elevated into something approaching legend. Their names are real names of pleasure steamers and fishing vessels from English harbors. J.B. Priestley on the BBC reads those names into the air as though they stand for something permanent about England. Most of those boats are crewed by Royal Navy personnel, not civilian volunteers. The story serves a purpose the people constructing it judge to be urgent. And then, on June 4th, Churchill stands up in the House of Commons and declines the myth entirely. He calls the evacuation a colossal military disaster. He says the whole root and core and brain of the British Army was stranded at Dunkirk and seemed about to perish or be captured. He says the country must not assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars, he says, are not won by evacuations. What he does not say in the chamber, what he turns and reportedly mutters to a colleague after sitting down, is something else entirely, that they'll fight with the butt ends of broken beer bottles, because that's bloody well all they've got. The BEF has been saved. Its equipment has not. 68,000 men killed or captured, virtually every tank, vehicle, and artillery piece left behind on French sand. The army exists, the arsenal does not. It is the speech that reaches the people through a BBC voice, not Churchill's. Vita Sackville-West, poet and writer, is at Sissinghurst in Kent when she hears it. She writes to her husband, Harold Nicholson, that same evening. She has heard the words repeated by the announcer. And even so, even filtered, second-hand, from a different voice, she feels something move. Shivers, she writes. Not of fear. The most famous speech of Britain's finest hour reaches its people through a stranger's voice, and it works anyway. June 10th. Italy declares war. The French government abandons Paris. The Home Intelligence, the classified daily summaries of public opinion drawn from regional observers, police reports, and mass observation, records the mood that Monday carefully. Anti-French feeling, which has been building since the first retreats, is dispersing at the surface. But it remains latent, the report notes, and may have to be reckoned with in the future. 4 days later, Paris falls without a battle. The streets are empty, the French army withdraws, and the Germans walk in. Home intelligence records the British public's reaction in language that seems, for a government report, almost tender. The heart is heavy, and sadness broods over conversation. There is disquiet, it says. There is no panic. Harold Nicholson is in London, working as parliamentary secretary and official censor at the Ministry of Information. And he is 53, trim, carefully dressed in the formal style of a man who came up through the diplomatic service. 2 days before Paris falls, he encounters a French writer named André Maurois, recently arrived from the city. Maurois tells him what it was like to leave. Nicholson writes it down that evening. Maurois had never before in his life experienced such agony as when he saw Paris basking under a lovely summer day and realized he might never see it again. Nicholson sits with this. Then he reaches for the closest comparison he can find. If the French feel about Paris what the English feel about England, he writes, then what Maurois is experiencing is the grief of a man watching not a city but a whole country about to be extinguished. If we were to feel the lanes of Devonshire, so the rocks of Cornwall and our own unflaunting England were all concentrated in one spot and likely to be wiped out, we would feel all the pain in the world. Somewhere in Barrow-in-Furness, a Lancashire shipbuilding town, a housewife named Nella Last is sitting near her wireless. She has been writing for mass observation since September 1939. Recording the daily texture of her life and the people around her. She is 50 years old. Her husband runs a joinery business. She is not a political figure. She's the person who listens to the news and then has to go on making dinner. In the summer of 1940, she's writing down what ordinary life feels like when the world is ending somewhere close. On June 17th, Marshal Pétain's voice comes over the radio. He is 84 years old. The hero of Verdun, and he is telling France it must seek armistice terms. Britain hears this too. Home intelligence records the public reaction the following morning. Confusion and shock, but hardly surprise. That phrase, hardly surprise, does something important if you let it. By the 3rd week of June, many British civilians have been arriving at this moment in their heads for weeks. They have watched the bulletins worsen, the maps shrink, the communiques turn evasive. Some part of them has been standing at the edge of this cliff for 10 days. The confirmation still hits. But what it produces is not simply grief. What it produces, in a significant portion of the population, and the mass observation files are clear about this, is anger. Britain had sent its professional army to France. France had been the reason the army was there, and Britain had lost 68,000 men and virtually all its heavy equipment trying to keep France in the war. Now France is gone. The word the historians reach for, examining the MO reports from late June, is resentment, not sorrow. Resentment. On June 22nd, France signs the armistice, deliberately in the same railway carriage at Compiègne, where Germany surrendered to France in 1918. Hitler sits in the same chair Ferdinand Foch occupied that day. The American journalist William Shirer watches from 50 yards away. Hitler's face, he reports, is afire with scorn, anger, hate, revenge, triumph. 3 days later, Churchill addresses Parliament. He is careful. He asks the House not to waste strength and time on hard words and reproaches toward France. He calls the French people trustees of liberal civilization, and he hopes life and power will be given to rescue them from ruin and bondage. From the floor of the House, an unidentified member speaks. The remark is recorded in Hansard. 4 words, delivered in response to Churchill's call for restraint, and by the politicians. One unrehearsed line in an official transcript. popular anger briefly surfacing through the floor of the House of Commons and immediately submerging again. But what Churchill is managing here is more complex than civilian resentment. Inside the cabinet, Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, has been arguing for seeking terms, not capitulation. Negotiated peace through Mussolini as a mediator. The option existed. It was discussed at the highest level of the British government. And among the public, the mass observation archive records something that sits uncomfortably alongside the received image of the finest hour. Private voices, writing under the anonymity the MO scheme provides, that express exhaustion and low morale, a desire for the war to end, whatever the victor. This is the part of 1940 the myth asks you to forget. It is also, once understood, the part that matters most. Because if the defiance of the summer of 1940 was inevitable, if it was simply what British people were always going to do, a natural expression of national character, then it cost nothing. It required nothing. It was automatic. It was not automatic. Halifax sat at the cabinet table. In the mass observation diaries, voices wrote, anonymously, under the protection the scheme provided, of wanting the war to end on any terms, whoever won. And the consensus was fragile. What Churchill's achievement, what the achievement of the British public, actually consisted of was not the performance of an inevitable unity. It was holding enough people in enough places long enough for the moment to pass. That is a harder thing, and a more remarkable one. June 18th, the longest day of the year in wartime, double summer time, which means the light stays until well after 10 in the evening. London is blacked out, curtains drawn, street lamps dark. But the sky beyond the windows is still pale blue with summer. The Thames gleams in late light past shuttered houses. This afternoon, Churchill stood in the House of Commons for 36 minutes. He revised his 23-page typescript during the speech itself. His peroration is set out on the page in something close to blank verse, and he speaks of the survival of Christian civilization, of Hitler knowing he must break this island or lose the war, of broad sunlit uplands if Britain can endure. And then, let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties and so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. What people in Britain hear that evening is not Churchill's voice. It is, again, a BBC announcer reading the words on the nightly news. Vita Sackville West writes to Nicholson again from Sissinghurst. She heard it, repeated by the announcer. She calls the phrases Elizabethan. She says they carry behind them the whole massive backing of power and resolve, like a great fortress. She says they are never words for words' sake. A speech that never reached its people in the speaker's own voice, received at second hand through a stranger in a blacked-out room. And still, it does what it was built to do. 2 days later, Churchill sits in secret session with the House. Away from the public record, he says what the famous speeches do not say. His best chance of American intervention, he tells the House, is the spectacle of Britain engaged in a heroic struggle. The great speeches of 1940 are not only addressed to the British public, they are performances designed to impress a watching world. The British people are the audience. The British people are also the prop. Both things are simultaneously, completely accurate. Neither cancels the other. At 10 o'clock that same June 18th evening, in a BBC studio at Portland Place, a man steps up to a microphone. He is tall, extraordinarily tall, 6 feet 4 inches, in French Army service dress, a kepi bearing the 2 stars of a brigadier general. He is 49 years old. Until 2 weeks ago, he held a junior cabinet post in a government that no longer exists. His name is Charles de Gaulle, and almost nobody in Britain has heard of him. He speaks in French. He speaks of a flame. He says the flame of French resistance must not die and will not die. He speaks for a few minutes. He finishes. He steps back from the microphone. The broadcast was not widely publicized in advance. Estimates of the audience in France suggest it was tiny. Not a single public figure in France, de Gaulle will later remember, raised his voice to condemn the armistice that day. He spoke into a space that was, in every practical sense, nearly empty. But the voice was there. On the same evening that Britain felt entirely alone, on the day the myth was built of total abandonment, a Frenchman was in London, refusing. 9 days later. At dawn on July 3, 1940, elements of the Royal Navy's Force H arrive at Mers-el-Kébir, a harbor on the Algerian coast. The French fleet is anchored there. Battleships, cruisers, the instruments of a major naval power. Under the armistice terms, those ships are theoretically neutralized. What they represent to Churchill and the War Cabinet is a question that cannot be left unanswered. And Churchill will later write, "After the collapse of France, the question which arose in the minds of all our friends and foes was, will Britain surrender too?" The answer he gives is not a speech. The Royal Navy opens fire on the French fleet. The attack lasts a matter of minutes. It kills approximately 1,300 French sailors. The following day, July 4th, Churchill rises in Parliament to announce what has been done. The Conservative MPs who have watched him with reserve since May, whose natural allegiance had been to Chamberlain and the policy of appeasement, who came to the Commons in the aftermath of Dunkirk and heard the Beach's speech with something less than complete emotional commitment. These men now stand and cheer. They are cheering an attack on an Allies' navy. They are cheering proof that the country is not going to fold. And the political support Churchill has needed since May arrives here in the announcement of 1,300 dead French sailors, and not a moment sooner. Among the British public, the reaction is broadly the same. The anti-French anger building since the armistice finds in Mers-el-Kébir a terrible outlet. The deed says what the speeches have only implied: we are on our own and we intend to survive it. From Vichy, Pétain eventually responds. He accuses Britain of first abandoning France and then unjustifiably attacking it. In a narrow factual sense, Britain had done both. The BEF had been evacuated. The French fleet had been shelled. What matters is what Britain was trying to survive when it did them. But Pétain's accusation deserves a moment in the air before it is dismissed. Because the summer of 1940 does not resolve into a clean moral ledger. It resolves into a set of desperate choices made by people who had already run out of less desperate ones. De Gaulle's June 18th broadcast, the one almost nobody heard, was transmitted again the following day and the days after that. In time, it became the founding document of Free France. In 1944, de Gaulle rode through liberated Paris in an open car while a city silent for 4 years found its voice again. A French military court had condemned him to death in absentia for desertion. De Gaulle himself later commuted Pétain's death sentence to life imprisonment. Pétain died in prison in 1951. De Gaulle became president of France. Churchill led Britain through the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, North Africa, Italy, Normandy, and the liberation of Europe. And in July 1945, with the war in Europe won and the Pacific War still running, the British electorate voted him out of office. He received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1953, largely for the speeches and memoirs the war had produced. He died in January 1965. Harold Nicholson served at the Ministry of Information until Churchill, requiring a different arrangement, moved him elsewhere. He remained in Parliament, remained a diarist, remained a careful observer of the world he had watched crack open in 1940. He died in 1968. Nella Last kept writing. She wrote for mass observation until 1966. 26 more years beyond the summer of 1940, recording in the same careful, unguarded prose the texture of ordinary life in barrow and furnace. The war ended. Rationing ended. A new government came, then another. The festival of Britain. The coronation. 2 decades of peacetime accumulated around her. She kept sitting down and putting down what she saw and felt. No speeches, no monuments, just the daily record of a woman continuing to live. Her diaries are not monuments. They are something more honest than monuments. They are evidence that the summer of 1940 was not inhabited by legends, but by people. People who were frightened, who sat near their wireless sets in blacked-out rooms, who heard famous words through strangers' voices, who resented France and grieved for Paris and privately wondered, some of them, whether there was another way. The nation that built its self-image on standing alone had spent the 1930s enabling the conditions that made France's collapse possible. The appeasement that had seemed reasonable to many, sophisticated, even fed the machine that now stood across the channel. The finest hour was real. It was also the child of the years of failure that made it necessary. The blackout window, the wireless warming up in the dark, the long summer light beyond the curtains that cannot be drawn back. The people who held on in the summer of 1940 were not legends when they did it. They were frightened, often angry, sometimes privately willing to consider peace. The miracle was not that they were unafraid. The miracle was that they kept going anyway. Long enough for the moment to pass, long enough for the world to change its mind. That is what British civilians said when France abandoned them to fight alone, not with one voice, but with enough of them.